So welcome everyone to the Tsongas Industrial History Center's online workshop, Every Voice Counts, Teaching Civics Through Local History. My name is Kristen Gallus. I'm the Project Manager for Education Development at the Tsongas Industrial History Center, and I'll be your host and facilitator for tonight's webinar. The goal of this series is to highlight how underrepresented communities in Lowell, particularly African Americans, women, immigrants, and youth, have fought for an equitable electoral process and how, by overcoming barriers to civic participation, they've persevered to secure voice in the community. We hope to inspire educators to teach civics through local history and contemporary issues, connecting with the new Massachusetts social studies framework that focus on civics and civil rights. So I am going to share my screen. And Ellen, are you seeing my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So funding for this series was provided by Mass Humanities, and we're very proud to be part of the Mass Humanities series, The Vote, which is a statewide initiative to start conversations around civics. The Tsongas Industrial History Center is a partnership between the University of Massachusetts Lowell College of Education and the National Park Service. We are located in the historic boot mills of Lowell National Historical Park. Tsongas Industrial History Center is a hands-on center where students and teachers learn about the American Industrial Revolution through activities and tours of sites where history and science happened. In this time of remote learning, however, we are offering some exciting virtual field trips. Each is an in-depth look at a topic related to the Industrial Revolution, facilitated by professional educators with all of the energy and engagement of our in-person programs. And you can find out more about those at uml.edu/Tsongas. And here's a quick little list, a little preview of the programs we are offering through our virtual field trips. The first two, which are ready to be booked now, we are premiering those this week with an audience of actual fourth grade students. Immigration, Culture and Community, and Mill Girls, Life and Work in an Industrial City. We also have virtual field trips forthcoming on water power, human impact on the environment, building a diverse and inclusive school community, which uses the 1830 Lowell issue of Irish schools, establishing city-funded schools for the Irish community. And then we're going to be creating a virtual version of our very popular new second grade program called Community Connections. So we're really excited about that, and possibly more to come in the spring. So some quick housekeeping stuff before we start. Just wanted to remind you that this meeting is being recorded, including the chat. So you are welcome to use the chat. We want you to use the chat. We'll be instructing you to use the chat throughout the evening, but it is recorded. Even your private chats are recorded. So just take a note on that. And we will be posting the video from tonight's proceedings on the uml.edu/Tsongas/civics website. So our agenda tonight is I'm just going to review the Zoom tools real quick. We're going to do a quick who's in the room poll so that we know who's watching with us. We're going to do, then we'll get to the main event, which is Allison's presentation. We'll do some questions and answers. I'm going to introduce some companion documents and writing prompts that we've put together based on the topic of Mill Girls and the suffrage movement in Lowell, and then just some closing thoughts. So I'm sure everybody is overly familiar with Zoom right now, but of course you know where the mute button is and the video button is. Feel free to use those. There will be time later if you want to unmute yourself to ask a question during a Q&A. Certainly allow you to do that. In the meantime, though, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll monitor those before the Q&A starts. So before I introduce Allison, I am going to put up some quick polls. So if you guys don't mind, I'd like to know who's in the room. So if you could let us know, what state do you teach in or region? All right, looks like we're all in Massachusetts tonight. Share that with everybody so you can see it's 100% Massachusetts in the room. The next poll I'm going to ask is, what grade do you teach? So I'll share that with you. We have a nice mixed group, middle school folks, informal learning environment, college, university, and other. And then just one last quick, what subjects do you teach? All right, just share that so everybody can see. Looks like we're history, social studies, civics, and other. Excellent. Thank you for indulging that. So let's get right to the main event. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Allison Horrocks is a park ranger at Lowell National Historical Park. Allison earned her PhD in history from the University of Connecticut in 2016. Her main areas of research are women's work, education, and public history. Over the past decade, Allison has worked at a range of historic house museums and historic sites all over New England. And she is most famously known as the co-host of the American Girls podcast, if you are in that certain age group of fans of American Girl dolls. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Allison. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go ahead and turn that over to her. Go ahead, Allison.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and just make sure that that goes off okay. Believe. How's this? Excellent. So I want to thank you all so much for spending part of your day with us and also for giving us another hour of screen time. Really do appreciate that, especially today. So my general topic is Mill Girls and the suffrage movement. And part of what I'd like to do is illuminate a few specific incidents in labor history, and then talk a little bit more broadly about work, power, and how we write and think about these things. I always tell people that it's a privilege to tell the stories of the workers of Lowell. That is my day job, and it is something that is an honor to me. What I won't be doing is taking you through a series of walkouts and petitions and kind of laying a nice stack of events to take us right to 1920. I think it's very tempting to ask, how did we get here, or how did women get there? And to give history this kind of feeling that this was inevitable. But we really can't understand rights, and especially civil rights, this way in the US. There's nothing natural or easy or progressive about the past 400 years of US history. And to get us into a headspace to think about that, I actually don't want us to talk or think about Lowell just yet. What I'd like you to do is something that I think will be relatively easy in 2020, which is to think about something that is frustrating to you today. And that can be something small, that can be something big. I don't want us to think about women in bonnets and men walking around a muddy city and digging canals just yet. I want us to think about that word frustration, because I think that's really at the core of what a lot of people are experiencing today, and also the very long trajectory towards women's suffrage. What is something that you would like to change if you could? And do you have the power to do that? And what kind of support would you need from other people to make that happen? All of these are the kinds of questions and the kinds of concerns that women and people generally fighting for suffrage had to think about all the time. The people I'll be talking about today dealt with a lot of small irritants. We read letters about poorly made coffee or people running late who are supposed to be helping you. But we also know from the mill girl experience that they also dealt with great injustices, their own disenfranchisement, as well as moral outrage at civic and moral concerns. But I also think it's important to remember that most of the people who lived and worked in Lowell in the period that I'll be talking about mostly did their work. They completed their tasks as they were assigned. They took their wages and they saved or they spent their money, and many would just go home after a few years of working in Lowell. The women workers of the 1830s and 1840s had long days in factory buildings and long nights in boarding houses, or I should say busy nights in boarding houses. Many of them belonged to multiple communities, and often they would have felt stretched, mind and body. At least twice a day, they had to walk into a factory building where time was not their own anymore. When they did resist, whether that was by walking out, striking, or reading on the job, they were met with criticism, personal attacks, and often threats to their livelihoods. For every moment where we can identify someone who stood up, stepped out, or walked away, or signed their name to a piece of paper that would have changed their lives and others, we know that there's millions of other moments where people stood up and stuck with the mundane. There's all of these ordinary frustrations that surround that one flashpoint. So with that, I want us to talk and take a clear look at how we know what we know about women's suffrage. I mentioned that some women would sign their names to things. This is a petition from the period we'll be talking about in detail later. There are really two sources by former mill workers that give us a huge insight and have a very large influence on what we think Lowell was like in the 1830s and 1840s. In 1889, the poet Lucy Larcom, Lois is her mother, writes A New England Girlhood. Close to a decade later, Harriet Hanson Robinson publishes Loom and Spindle, 9 years after the fact. Larcom and Robinson had very similar childhoods. They were both born outside of Lowell and came as children with widowed mothers. Both of their mothers had to make a hard decision to bring their children to Lowell and to conscribe their children to a life of factory work and to not really having a childhood they may have expected. Each of these women worked in a factory, though not together, and later they both became writers, sometimes together, but often apart. They were friends for most of their lives. They were also outliers. Very few people who ever worked in Lowell wrote an entire book about it. Most women wrote letters. Many contributed stories or poems to certain magazines, but very few would make a career as an author. And these two did, and they were very proud of the work that they did as young people in a young city. Larcom especially wanted readers to understand that her factory labor was dignified. She spoke directly to readers of girlhood, arguing, "It is the first duty of every woman to recognize the mutual bond of universal womanhood." She called it inhuman to look down on factory girls. Larcom continues, "She is really the superior person who has accepted her work and is doing it faithfully." She had this idea that factory women should not be degraded, and this was very important to her worldview. Lucy Larcom was curious, she was smart, and she was fascinated by what Lowell had to offer her. She wrote, "The years between 1835 and 1845 seem to me, as I look back, singularly interesting. People were guessing and experimenting and wondering and prophesying about a great many things, almost everything. Steamboats, railroads, mesmerism, and more. Larcom's Lowell was hard and hectic, but it also had a kind of shine to it. It's the place where her world cracked open and important people validated her interest in writing. To her, larger social transformations were heightened here, so much so that she later bemoaned the fact that, quote, things that looked miraculous then are commonplace now." Above all, Larcom appreciated that young women who worked at Lowell had the advantage of living in a community where character alone commanded respect. Larcom was interested in the dignity of factory labor and Lowell's literary culture. Harriet had a different approach. Young Harriet, who worked for the Tremont and Boot corporations, was brought to Lowell by what people called the whip of necessity. She worked hard from a young age, and her view of Lowell is different, has more of a teeth and an edge. In Loom and Spindle, Robinson recounts her family's struggle, surly factory owners, and a walkout. In the fall of 1836, Robinson and her fellow operatives learned that wages were to be cut down. She was 11, but keenly aware of her family's finances. Nevertheless, she was among hundreds of women who decided to walk out, breathe the autumn air, and leave the lint-filled factory floor behind. Together with upwards of 1,500 others, Harriet went to Chapel Hill to listen as, quote, one of the girls stood on a pump and gave vent to the feelings of her companions. It was the first time a woman had spoke in public in Lowell. This is Harriet. When this happened, former farm girls working 12 hours a day for pay was unconventional, but taken as a new norm in Lowell. Women standing and venting their feelings on the top of a hill, unconventional and not accepted as a new norm. But these women had been pushed to the edge, and they, quote, turned out and walked in procession through the streets. They had neither flags nor music, but sang songs. They demanded, isn't it a pity such a pretty girl as I should be sent away to the factory to pine away and die? And there's more to this song, but we're going to talk about it in a moment, and you will see why. Looking back on her bravado, Robinson remembers saying, I don't care what you do, I'm going to turn out whether anyone else does it or not. I think this is both a universally brave thing to do and rings true to something that is across time about being 11. This event was vivid in her memory and something she was still very proud of over 60 years later. It was also something her family paid dearly for. Her mother lost her job with the corporation, and the women who returned to work still had reduced wages. 2 years earlier, another group of women in Lowell had gone on strike. That 1834 walkout was also considered a failure. In these and other cases, thousands of women's frustrations had boiled over. When they made demands, they were generally ignored. Contemporary papers offered limited or timid coverage. The general push was for reconciliation and moving past the strike. Lowell was a place of contradictions in their childhood. Women could find many outlets for their voices, from clubs to lyceum to magazines, but their power was limited. When it came to their workplaces, they were told to develop themselves into wage earners, but not to think of themselves as a kind of class of workers. One refrain from that period went like this: stick to your text. But this city was supposed to be different from the factory towns Charles Dickens and others depicted and deplored. Lowell was a planned city, but this was not part of the plan. Young, quote, Yankee women were chosen to work on a temporary basis and recruited for that purpose. Paying skilled men would have cost more, so agents hired women and called the work unskilled. Even the highest paid woman would make less than any man in Lowell's corporate world. Lowell's architects imagined women to be more compliant and uncomplaining. Overall, they were right and they were wrong. In a city that ran on water power, and I would argue woman power in the factory, women had almost no say in any local organizations, their own workplaces, and of course, government. Their frustration, as expressed in petitions and walkouts, was part of a growing discontent among wage laborers. The carpenter Seth Luther, a labor activist who took part in an armed rebellion in Rhode Island, argued, our rights are not only endangered, but some of them already wrested from us by the powerful and inhuman grasp of monopolized wealth. And that's at the same time as these walkouts. For Luther, Robinson, and others, their mistreatment was unfair and un-American. As white Yankee New Englanders, they rejected harsh working conditions and the lack of power they faced in early industrial America. There was also a gender dynamic to this tide of resistance. For some people, women's walkouts were especially distasteful. Women, overall, were not supposed to speak in public or publish stories about their lives as workers, or assert agency through walkouts, or petition the legislature for better conditions. In Lowell, they did all of these things. Other women with privileged enough to speak up were also starting to organize elsewhere. Just over a decade after these walkouts, people in favor of expanded voting rights convened in Seneca Falls, New York. 2 years later, there was a national convention in Worcester. Women were animated to take part in suffrage campaigns explicitly for many reasons. For some, it was the moral push to end slavery. For others, it was temperance. Others saw workers' rights and women's rights as intertwined. How could a woman worker advocate for herself if legally she was covered by a husband or father? In all cases, suffrage movements never happened in a vacuum, and they grew in conflict or in tandem with other causes. Harriet Hanson Robinson especially became interested in women's rights. She admired the work of women such as Julia Ward Howe and aspired to be like them. As a member of the National Women's Suffrage Association, Robinson was chosen to write the first history of women's suffrage in the state. In this lengthy study, Robinson emphasized the importance of women's activism, club work, and writing in Lowell. She even included an entire appendix on the Lowell offering, which is kind of off topic, which she and Larcom had contributed to as young people. Robinson notes in this section that the hardworking authors were granddaughters of patriots. They had good New England blood in them. Even in this very early history of suffrage, a revision of the past was happening. Robinson wrote that everything changed when, quote, the foreign element crept in and destroyed the idyllic life of the Lowell factory operatives. Remember, she went on strike at 11. In an echo of our own time, Robinson praised certain types of protest, but found little sympathy for others. She generally felt little empathy for the new wave of workers who replaced her generation. Remember that Robinson and Larcom came from families on the brink of poverty. Robinson's husband also had an unpredictable career, and her family faced food insecurity for many years. Still, Robinson writes with disdain for the, quote, poorly clothed, uncombed foreigners who came to Lowell when she was a teenager. Her poverty was due to unfortunate downturns. Theirs was innate. She explains, blood tells even in factory people. Around the time that Larcom was becoming a teacher in Illinois, and Robinson had continued her education and then pursued a family life with her husband, Lowell was changing fast. In the 1840s, early 1840s, Lowell had a very small Black population and a rapidly growing Irish community. By 1845, 29% of the population was of Irish descent. That number leapt by several thousand in just 5 years. As other new workers came to town, Lowell's foreign-born numbers went from 3.7% the year of Robinson's walkout to nearly 62% just before the Civil War. When Robinson writes about the mill girls of yore, she's thinking of herself, not of immigrants who came to remake their lives in subsequent years. When Robinson writes her suffrage history and later her memoir, she had long moved on from Lowell. Larcom and Robinson cared about labor's dignity and women's rights, but from the frame of their own experience. They gave talks on earlier outrage, but had little to say about contemporary strikes. For Larcom especially, her life was an example of what was possible for factory women. The fact that it had become almost impossible for anyone else to do seemed to be beside the point. In Robinson's case, as Claudia Bushman has astutely noted, once she left Lowell, she, quote, did not mix with Black women at all, except for Sojourner Truth. She also, quote, didn't mix with poor women, except as an employer, and did not care to. Having lifted herself out of factory work, Robinson used her mill girl story to gain political capital, but she was no hero of the working class. This partially explains why Robinson aligned with the group that she did, and not the more progressive American Women's Suffrage Association, which supported the 15th Amendment and suffrage for Black men. Famously, Robinson had a falling out with Lucy Stone, who was an ardent supporter of abolition and the 15th Amendment. This also explains why her first draft of Massachusetts suffrage history does not emphasize Stone's radical politics. The Lowell that lit a spark under Larcom and Robinson was a place where they believed that Yankee women, even if they worked all day, deserved respect and some modicum of power. Sure, they had less power in relation to mill owners and most men, but they understood that they had power over others as well. In Larcom's book, she details a local fascination with phrenology. Robinson recalls white women marching and declaring that they would not be treated as slaves. As hard as they worked, their servitude in a factory was a choice and temporary condition. Part of understanding their value as women and laborers was knowing that they should not be treated as, quote, others, whether that be an Irish woman relegated to cleaning the floor or a Black woman held in bondage. Factory work was temporary for most people in the 1830s and 40s. By the 1850s, Lowell was hardly an experiment. It was a full-fledged and big industrial city. When the first generation of laborers was leaving Lowell, the old ethic of paternalism and investment in workers' lives through boarding houses and boarding house culture was eroding. Subsequent workers, including children, faced greater food insecurity, long hours, and little leverage considering their status in society. And still, they also protested, formed unions, created newspapers, and sought leverage by running for office. The largest labor revolution of arguably all of United States history also happened alongside this change. Millions of Black people freed themselves. While a vocal minority would indict Lowell and other cities for expanding the slave trade, most people of that time were content to ignore those connections altogether. What's especially frustrating in retrospect is the lack of attention given to working class women in the 1840s, when activists tried to speak directly to legislatures and demand change. Sarah Bagley, another contributor to the Lowell Offering, led a charge for shorter working days and later edited the radical newspaper, The Voice of Industry. Teresa Ann Murphy describes the activists of Bagley's era this way, quote, "They fought for a 10-hour day and sought access to a world of leisure that would bring them time, not only for salvation and reform, but intellectual development. They confronted a workplace in which the physical activities of wage earning were divorced from the intellectual excitement of learning. Without a chance to think, they would be less human." This kind of thinking is exactly what motivated all of these women to edit a newspaper and to speak out and tell their story. But in later decades, there was a desire among publishers to only tell certain stories about industry. Larcom may not have been as extreme as a Horatio Alger story, but her bootstraps journey did well on the market. Clearly, there was a demand by the 1890s for women who had made it, seemingly by their own virtue. But we can't ever lose sight of that bigger context. Larcom and Robinson were writing their mill girl stories amidst a series of labor crises and major population growth. From the Haymarket riot of 1886 to the Pullman strikes of 1892 and Homestead, labor and capital were on a chaotic collision course in the late 19th century. At the same time, the number of people born outside of the United States rose by almost 40%. Around this time, Larcom wrote a poem called An Idyll of Work. She knew that most work was far from it, but middle-class readers would have seen the headlines about strikes and, as it appears, preferred workers' perspectives from a long-retired mill girl. And still, among the working class, women, and most people in the United States, voting rights remained elusive. Even with the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, the right to vote was very limited through the 19th century. The first women to actually vote in Lowell were women who could pay a real estate tax, and they voted for school committee. By this time, suffrage had become a full-blown, huge social movement in the United States, but we don't see a large base in Lowell. There was an Equal Suffrage League office, prominent temperance organizations, and of course, many women's groups. But the majority of women seemed by this time to be voting with their feet in other ways, again, out of the factories and into the streets. There are later suffragists born in Lowell, such as Florence Lescombe and Alice Parker Lesser, and they went home for events and rallies. But these prominent individuals did not build a career in Lowell. They left, and they were not part of the large working class bloc that made up most of the city. When it came time for a 1915 state referendum on voting, male Lowellians who could vote generally rejected it. It seemed only to be popular in Belvedere. I think it's hard to underestimate the extent to which class matters in this story. Though suffragists were often outside of the labor movement, they actually gained the most traction when they borrowed labor activist tactics. Standing on street corners, soapboxes, and giving speeches, suffragists of the teens in the 1900s actually echoed the striking mill girls and other strikers of recent decades. While met with much shock, many of these women who gave voice and motion to their frustration were still met with derision. Elsewhere in Lowell, some avowedly political women were also working to make change, but not focusing on the ballot box. In 1912, the labor leader Elizabeth Gurley Flynn came to Lowell. In The Rebel Girl, she writes about a Polish striker who she calls a modern prototype. She had to be hauled away by 6 policemen, and Flynn clarifies, the workers on strike in 1912 were not descendants of earlier women strikers who had long since gone west or moved into other occupations. The 1912 workers were foreign-born. What Flynn is pointing to is the incredible diversification of the city and a kind of worker, an activist whose actual foreignness made their activism less legible and less likely to be recognized. This story, when told in full, also hints at the violence enacted by strikers and protesters by this time. In the early 20th century, the deployment of Pinkertons, police, and National Guardsmen made striking an incredibly dangerous business. And still, that pulsing beat played over and over. A majority of people could not elect people who would represent them, and so they walked. There is no straight or easy line between the 1830s and 1920. There is a common thread. Ordinary people have long chosen to reject situations that frustrate them and demand a change. Flynn herself would conclude in 1917, the only people whose names are recorded in history are those who did something. The peaceful and indifferent are forgotten. They never know the fighting joy of living. I think this is partially right. The people who control the narrative are often the ones who gain the time at some point to keep and set the record straight through their own filters. Most everyone who worked in a factory in Lowell stood by a machine for hours or years. What happens to a mind when the body is forced to stand, move, and repeat the same things over and over and over and over? We know that people cope, they adapt, they accept, and they modify their lives in different ways. But some people, when pushed to the edge, resist and walk out. Others mourn and organize and come together. Those evenings that Larkham, Robinson, and others had in the boarding house set the stage for a culture of resistance, but as we see, not a revolution. This is why Lowell continues to be a place where people fight for their rights to stand, to speak, and to have their voice count. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison. So,
and I apologize. I have so many more slides and I'm just terrible at hitting next, and I'm happy to share them. I stopped and I apologize. I have like 42 slides, so I'm happy to share the material.
well, I was going to suggest, so if you could stop sharing screen now, and then with your permission, I will post I will send out the slides to this group, and then I will post them if that's okay too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So if folks have questions for Allison, you can put them in the chat. Although I was furiously writing down a whole bunch of things that I wanted to bring forward. So seeing nothing in the chat, I will take the opportunity to ask the first question. I really enjoyed how you framed the talk around this. I don't know, I didn't get the whole question, but the sort of thesis of frustration, right? I thought that was really fascinating. So in speaking to our audience here of teachers, educators of all sorts, how might we pull that thread of frustrations and create that sort of relevance piece that you started out with for us?
Yeah, so I think part of what I was looking for, common connections between our world today and theirs, and I think there's actually quite a lot. But I think the reason why I chose to fix on that common theme is we look at something like the 1834 turnout, the 1836 walkout, or we look at the petition writing of the 1840s or another period, and it's a small number of people who actually engage to that high level. And I think that's a hugely important point, because part of why Lowell sustains the system that it does is most people, whether we like to admit this or not, comply, right? They come to a planned city and there is a system in place, and most people work within that framework. So I think part of the question is, what are the conditions under which people reject that? What is the actual turning point, the actual moment where people choose to make a change? And I think what Robinson did in telling her own story in Loom and Spindle is both very fascinating and sort of dangerous, because she takes a lot of credit for the 1836 walkout. And I included on one of the slides a passage where she says, there's nothing she's more proud of, unless women's suffrage were to pass, than that walkout. We look at contemporary coverage. Most people were both unimpressed with this walkout or irritated by it as this kind of blip of, women acting out. I'm not saying that she gives herself too much credit, because we don't know, we weren't there, but I think it's very fascinating the way that she reframes this event that would have been the culmination of weeks, if not months, of women having serious conversations as sort of a rash decision by an 11-year-old. It's also not shocking when we think about the human condition. You're 11 years old and you hear that some people might leave to go take a walk. You either keep working or go take a walk with your friends. Hello, what are we going to choose? So we rely really heavily on her interpretation. And again, it's not that it's disingenuous, it's not that it's untrue, but it keeps us from seeing the pot that had been boiling for months. She has this childish bravado. That's fascinating. That's very interesting. Her family pays a very real price. But basically the rest of her life, she capitalizes and uses this certain version of herself as a mill girl, not to really make meaningful change for other people, but in her case, to gain access to an upper class group of women suffragists. And that's not surprising. Women's suffrage in a lot of Massachusetts was not a working class woman's game. The predominant organizations were for people who had time to read and to write. The Lowell women of the 1830s and 40s are this really bizarre combination of people who work very hard, are not wealthy, but have evenings free of domestic obligations. That's why you have a fertile activist culture, but that's also why it's very hard to replicate in other times.
Well, I think that's so fascinating, and I appreciate the fact that you highlighted that separation or the role of class in the suffrage movement and in movements in general, and where that power lies. And as you were talking about Harriet sort of using that story to in her writing prowess, catapult herself into that group of women, right, who had daddies with money or husbands with money, or the life of luxury, and didn't come from that working class background. I don't think that gets talked about enough in the suffrage movement. I want to pull out another thread, pardon the pun, of something that you said, and thinking back to my own schooling and U.S. History 1, right? This idea of the suffrage movement growing in tandem with other causes. I think now in this anniversary year, we're seeing suffrage as a scope rather than a 2 or 3 year chunk of time. But if you could speak a little bit to that intertwining of other movements, you sort of addressed that with the separation of the women's suffrage movement, the women who supported the 15th Amendment and the women who were just out for women's suffrage. So could you talk a little bit about how those movements sort of intertwine and ebb and flow with each other?
Yeah, so part of what happens in like the 1830s and 1840s is there are women who are putting on a kind of period appropriate, but maybe not fully authentic modesty. When they go to stand and to speak publicly about an issue, they do so kind of with this language, and there's some great edited collections that talk about abolition and women's suffrage together, where women are rising to speak, and they're saying that they're just so moved by the moral cause of ending slavery that they have to step outside of their bounds to speak. And I think part of what's really fascinating and different about that account of women in 1836, we do have multiple accounts, is this woman who is, quote, venting, which is their language, in 1836 on the top of this hill, is talking about her problems. She's talking about problems that she and her fellow workers are facing. And that would have been so incredibly shocking to people in the 1830s, that not only is this woman speaking, she's not speaking on behalf of someone else for a moral cause, she's speaking for herself, and she's speaking on behalf of this class of workers. We see a lot of activity in Lowell and elsewhere among women who are interested in temperance. So people abstaining from alcohol, they're interested in ending the slave trade, or they're interested in kind of writing and thinking about what abolition might look like. And that's where a lot of those movements come together. But I think the key kind of takeaway is there's this germ here that women gain experience that's then applicable to the suffrage movement. Like Harriet Hanson Robinson is a good example of learning how to be part of a group and learning what it's like to have to be scrappy in some ways, to not necessarily have money. Makes her an asset in Massachusetts to the women's suffrage movement. She's very active in fundraising. She's a great speaker, and she had access to a free public education in Lowell, and that's huge. One of her essays that she keeps the rest of her life is called Poverty Not Disgraceful. And it's that you should never feel ashamed of being poor. When she has the opportunity to be kind of a mouthpiece, however, in the 1890s, you can see that she's changed somewhat, where she does see a fundamental difference between someone like herself and someone who's an Irish woman worker who comes in the 1840s or 1850s. And I think those biases, that class element, we're not going to understand the suffrage movement if we ignore it. It's not helpful. Even someone like Lucy Larcom, being really interested in phrenology, right? This is the world that they're exposed to. They're being trained to think in those boarding houses and empower themselves. They're also being trained with things like those songs to say, I am not a slave, explicitly, to understand themselves as superior to other people. I think looking at those limits of a movement is very important because it helps us to understand better. It's not just that Robinson and someone like a Lucy Stone had a falling out. There's a fundamental difference in what they're striving for, which is not always equality for more people.
That's really interesting. And I think what this anniversary has also brought about is the diversity of the suffrage movement and the stories of the suffrage movement that have been so void. And I would like to highlight a resource for folks that I mentioned last week. It's a podcast that was done jointly with the National Park Service called And Nothing Less. I'm putting the title in the chat, and it highlights stories of women of color and other previously marginalized stories from the suffrage movement history. And I recommend it. Great, easy podcast listening. So I'm going to break right now from Allison's Q&A, and I'm going to share a few resources with you all, and then feel free if you have any questions for Allison to put them in the chat, because we'll probably have a few minutes on the other end. So I'm going to share my screen for a moment and show you all some resources that we've prepared to go along with Allison's presentation. So you should be seeing a website screen. Is that correct? A web page? Okay, excellent. This is Mill Girls and the Suffrage Movement on top. So this is the web page that you probably all went to register about Allison's presentation this evening. And on this page, there are two links here, one for a Google site, which is a set of documents, and the other, which is a Google form, which is a set of questions and writing prompts. So the Google site is a mini collection of some documents that were curated by one of our staff members, and it has everything from, and each page has a little bit of context, so it's just why we chose this document. So proceedings from a women's rights convention in 1850. And this is the one that you were talking about in Worcester, Allison. So, you see sort of how this larger movement is kicking off here. Can't have a suffrage collection without Susan B. Anthony. So we have included her here. And in her lecture titled, "Is it a crime for a citizen of the United States to vote?" And of course, we can't be Lowell without excerpting Harriet Hanson Robinson's memoir. So instead of quoting from Harriet, we actually quoted the epigraphs that she uses at the beginning of the book. She selected Plato and talking about how the gifts are equally diffused between both sexes in Plato's Republic. So we ask kids to think about, students as they're reading through this, why do you think she chose this? What is it about Plato's writings that are inspiring her? And, what argument is he making that she's, by the fact that she chose this, making as well? So in addition to excerpts from actual documents, we also included a couple of political cartoons. This is one that's been making its rounds recently. So we ask students to look at, if you start at the bottom, this sort of stairway of love and marriage and children and home and the sort of ideal woman of the time, and how as this woman climbs away from home and family towards suffrage and liberty, she's strife and anxiety and loneliness is her life. Also another poster from the anti-suffrage movement, again, looking at this sort of domestic womanhood and how sort of that anti-suffrage argument. There's an interesting case that happened in Boston, a rally, a parade. So we've highlighted an article and asking students to think about, why would somebody be anti-suffrage? What is that argument that they're making? How is the newspaper treating the pro-suffragists and the anti-suffragists? What is the press saying about them? And then finally, sort of this geographic sort of anomaly that happens where Western states are providing suffrage when Eastern states aren't. And that's often a flip from how we think about progressiveness, and East Coast states being way more progressive than Western states. But here we are, looking at women's rights from a Western states point of view in the early 20th century. Each page also has vocabulary, and they're all sourced. And of course, we just took pieces and excerpts of them, but if you wanted to get the full source, those are there as well. If you click on the Google form, you'll be asked to make a forced copy so that you can put it right in your LMS or Google Classroom, Learning Management System, and assign it to your students. So there are questions for each of the documents, and then we have a summary sort of reflection activity where we ask students, what methods do we have at our disposal today that might have helped the suffragists of the early 20th century be more successful? Imagine yourself in conversation with Harriet Taylor or Susan B. Anthony or Harriet Hanson Robinson. How would you advise them to shift their messaging? What tactics might have been more successful? How could they counteract the negative anti-suffrage publicity? So we're really asking students to analyze what happened, and obviously with that informed perspective of the 21st century, what could they do? And again, this is to inspire them to find that relevance in the content, but then find that voice, right? Every voice counts. And so can they take some of this energy that they're getting from this 20th century, 19th century story and bring it into the 21st century? So the recording and Allison's slides will also be posted on this site, but it takes us a while to do the 508 compliance to make them accessible, and also to do the subtitles on the video. So those won't be available for a while, but as soon as I have it ready, I will email all of you with the information. So you will have it before everybody else does. So I'm going to stop my share. Thank you, Ellen, for putting the URL in the chat. So Taya asked, are there resources that show men's perspectives too? That's really interesting. I am not sure. I would actually have to go to Allison to ask you about those cartoons that I showed, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in the anti-suffrage movement. Are those from a man's point of view, or are those the women in the anti-suffrage movement making those?
That specific one, I don't know, but I also know that, you know, like women, men had a lot of different reasons for and against. You know, someone like Harriet Hanson, when she marries William Stevens Robinson, she marries someone who's really a political ally, and they agree on many things, and he's very keen to see women get active in politics. And they're also kind of in the abolitionist fight for a short period together as well. Part of what comes to mind, to be honest with you, if you're Massachusetts based, newspapers tend to be the male voice, and the Lowell Sun, that is especially true in the early 20th century. One of my favorite articles I read was right around the time that ratification seemed imminent. The Lowell Sun ran an article that told women to, quote, "don't be a regular." And what this meant was, even if women had that official enfranchisement, to not really make themselves connected with politics. So this is a very interesting thing, you know, as other people have noted, that very rapid devaluing of this major achievement for some women. And part of what you see in the Lowell Sun is you see these kind of conflicting things, which is, I had to read other newspapers to know that Lowell hosted plays to teach women how to vote. And this happened in many places. They were trying to really teach people what does it mean to actually register. When you think of the ratification happening in August 1920, they had a presidential election that year. So the heat is on to get women registered. There's this huge, huge pressure on groups like the League of Women Voters. Florence Lescombe, who's from Lowell originally, plays a huge role in making sure that women are actually able to get out that right to vote. And then you have the predominant paper, or one of the papers in a community, really discouraging women from getting involved, from saying, you know, this is really not something that's tasteful for women to be a part of. I think also, you know, people vote and they express their voice that way. The fact that none of the wards in Lowell really came out in support of women's suffrage except Belvedere. You can imagine the slightly wealthier community. The women who are running groups such as the Equal Suffrage League, I tracked them down. That's where they live, right? So there are people who have access to that cultural and political capital anyway. They are probably the ones telling their husbands to vote for women's suffrage, or they're in agreement already. But generally, you look at that 1915 referendum, it did not give suffragists much hope. Most people expressed what they thought by saying no to women's suffrage.
Any other questions for Allison? Well, if not, I'm going to pose one of my fun hypothetical questions to you, Allison. How do you think the United States would be different if women had been franchised in the original Constitution instead of 130 years later? What would it have been like?
I think that's interesting. I think there's a temptation to think that women would be morally superior, and that's an argument that suffragists actually give us. I think an interesting addition to that is, imagine if people who were held in bondage counted as a full person. Imagine if there wasn't a 3/5 clause and there wasn't this kind of compromise that some people are not really fully people. It's interesting. I think if there was actually universal suffrage, the country would be very different, but I also think the vote would mean less. And I don't think that's me being cynical. I think if everyone had access to it, it wouldn't have the same power. I think when you look from, you know, let's say late 1790s to the present, it has been a constant tide to get even a minority the ability to vote. I mentioned Luther, who's this Rhode Island activist, in part because poor white male Rhode Islanders staged a literal armed rebellion to get the right to vote. So, you know, that's happening. And he and others in that rebellion were correspondents with Sarah Bagley. So she is not someone that you would put as a suffrage leader, but she's a labor activist who understands the power of capital and how she's going to work in that system. So how the country would be different, I genuinely think we'd talk about voting a lot less, because I think people would find rhetorical means to make it less valuable if everybody had it. You know, everybody pays taxes and we don't see it as a privilege. So there's that too. No, it's a good question though.
Well, thank you, Allison, and you gave me a perfect segue to introduce next week's topic. So if you're not registered for next week's presentation, Tuesday, October 20th at 6:30, we're going to, Professor Elizabeth Herman-Triant from the UMass Lowell History Department is going to be talking about the success and failure of the 15th Amendment and African American voting rights. You can register at that URL that Ellen posted in the chat. And I just want to say thank you again to Allison so much for imparting some really wonderful information to us. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you to Mass Humanities for their generous support. Like I said, I will, as soon as I can tomorrow, send out this recording and Allison's slides to you. And if you want to share it with some friends, please feel free to do so. We'll also post it eventually on the website. So thank you again and good night, and we hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.